it's with a degree of temerity that I address you this evening, because I'm not a historian. I'm very aware of the considerable skills that that are out there, and this is actually an idea that I came across probably over a year ago now, and I thought it might be of interest to my my neighbours in the history group in the Art Society. And I met up with one of them, and before I knew it, I got another job to do. And I took on the idea of developing the scrapblog concept in order to make it a practical reality. And what I'll do this evening is just briefly discuss why I think this might be of interest, and of interest to me, and perhaps of interest to you, the sort of components that go into making the scrapblog, and then the practical reality of actually producing one. So my interest in this is really from a social sciences perspective, that I'm interested in people and society and their interaction. In the research that I do as an academic, we rely on the narrative account of people and our interpretation of that account. And of course, history is written by those who write it and their interpretation thereof. So, the way that we understand this determines the way that we present it. And of course, my interpretation of a particular circumstance or event could be different from yours, but they could both be perfectly valid interpretations. In fact, there's a very good book that was written some years ago now, presenting 3 different interpretations of the Cuban Missile Crisis, each of which was a valid account based on the evidence that was presented. Now, one of the areas that I'm also involved in as an academic is in technological innovation, and technology underpins society and is one of the drivers of society. And if I think back to my interest in agriculture, and I'm not sure if any of you have read Agricultural Fluctuations in Europe, a 700-year account thereof, but I can assure you it's very good bedtime reading. But one of the things that's interesting there is that actually the price of cereals actually varied very little over that 700-year period. And if you think about what makes markets work, and marketing is one of the things I'm interested in, it's the relationship between supply and demand, which is moderated by price. Well, what we saw in those circumstances then was that the market is moderated not by price or by demand, but by supply. And if there wasn't enough supply, people starved. It was as simple as that. And one of the responses perhaps to that was the enclosures that we started to see at the beginning of the 18th century. And I know there was a presentation on that just a few weeks ago, I believe. The UK was one of the first countries to enclose in this way, as we moved from subsistence agriculture to cash agriculture. And the benefit of that was that it released labour to work in the cities. And coincidentally, as those enclosures were taking place, so technology was changing and beginning to have its influence. And one of the great technological innovations of the 18th century was the steam engine. First invented, well, actually invented in the late 1600s, but really it was Newcomen's engine of the early 1700s, about 1720, 1710, something like that, that provided the motive power to drive the water out of coal mines, to pump water out, and thereby enabling more energy to be released through the mining of coal. And that energy provided the impetus for steam engines initially, which were ubiquitous in the 1700s. In fact, when I worked at Greenlands, which is the home of Henley Business School, and that was actually the original home of W.H. Smith, William Henry Smith, Viscount Hambledon as he became. My first office was in Engine House, and many of the leading farms and estates built an engine house to provide motive power. So what we saw was a tremendous development of technology and a growth in cities, and labour being released from the land through the greater efficiency of agriculture. And concurrent with that, and I'm thinking of Peter Wormel's book here, which was about the golden age of agriculture, which was from about the time of the repeal of the Corn Laws in the 1840s through to about the 1880s, 1890s. He notes that the class structure of a Victorian village spanned 16 different classes, from the paupers and widows at one end of the scale to the gentry and the aristocracy at the other end of the scale, with the yeomen and the squires somewhere in the middle of all of that. So, you know, the nature of society was changing, driven by technology, driven by innovation. And one of the great drivers of innovation is, regrettably, wars. There are many innovations attributable to wars, and of course war in itself is a great driver of change in society. And one of my other interests is in particularly the First World War, and I'm sure, like many of you, visited the battlefields and seen the breathtaking sights that there are there. Just outside Ypres is the largest Commonwealth War grave cemetery in the world, 11,800 graves in Tynecott Cemetery alone. So enormous changes in society. And what we saw was that change was as much driven and accelerated by the war as anything else. When the Prime Minister Lloyd George made his Homes Fit for Heroes speech shortly after the armistice was signed, you know, the great promise for the returning heroes as to how they would be treated. And of course, the technology shift continues and accelerated by war. You know, we can see things like maps, the Ordnance Survey in the early 1800s, based on the requirement for better use of artillery, and things like GPS, radar, the internet, all from defence expenditure. So these are great drivers of change in society, and reflect the way that society has developed, and that understanding underpins what we see and understand by the history as it affects the people who live it. And thinking about Hambledon, moving on to Hambledon and the art society that we have in Hambledon, just talking briefly about what we offer, what we have available. Our main resource is our photographic record. There's an archive of several hundred photographs of the village and the locality. And here is one of those photographs, and you can see there the building on the corner there, which I'll refer to later on. Actually, is called the New Inn. It's the New Inn because it was built as late as about 1700. And just next to the New Inn on the left-hand side is the house there with the upstairs windows open, and that's actually our house. And I'm speaking from the loft room there right now. I just wish we still had that motorcycle parked outside. That would be a thing to behold, wouldn't it? So our archive is a valuable resource that we use, and we use it in a number of ways. Particularly through our parish magazine, the Hambledonian, which has been around for many years, and is a rich resource for the use of the village. And it's a way in which we can engage with villagers and create that dialogue. We do that in a number of ways. For example, one of the things that we have is a regular article that appears in the Hambledonian. And just last night, we were talking about how we were going to present ourselves in future editions. Something that we've tried using the photographic resource is a sort of before and after photograph. And here you see a housing development on the northeastern edge of the village. Originally, of course, the photograph was in black and white, and here is that original photograph, and that is Banting's yard, a builder's yard, and we published these two photographs side by side to try and create a response and feedback, and to gain more information about the photograph and the history surrounding it. Another technique that we use is talking pictures, and you can see there the QR code. You know, here we are, the white heat of technology being utilized in the Hambledonian, where you can click through to the photograph to take a closer look. And this actually concerns the carriage that you see in the top right hand corner there, and here is some more detail about that, the feedback that we've had from that, where we had some amazing feedback about the history of the carriage. And believe it or not, it's still around and is preserved in the United States, of all places. And this was a great way of engaging with residents in the village and getting their insight and understanding surrounding those photographs. And I think that works really, really well. The other things that the history group does is events of various sorts, typically along a theme. It might be transport, and in this particular case on farming. And there's me in the terracotta jumper on the left-hand side there. And this was a fantastic event, as they always are. They're always extremely well attended. And there was a big crowd in the village hall on that particular occasion. One of the things that was of particular interest to people was a scrapbook, a handwritten scrapbook with illustrations and photographs in it. And I could see people gathering around this and talking about what they were seeing. You know, who is this? What are they doing? Oh no, that's not him. That's somebody else. You know, and there was great discussion going on there. And that scrapbook was actually written by a lady called Bridget Goldsmith, who's now well into her 90s, still resident in the village, but obviously, you know, very aged now. But the Goldsmith family have a long history in Hambledon. Here are some gravestones in the churchyard going back to the 1700s. And Mrs. Goldsmith's husband, John, now no longer with us, actually wrote a history of Hambledon. So the scrapbook really resonated with me as a way of engaging with people, of understanding their insights of what was happening in the village, and it stimulated the thought in my mind as to how we could utilize this within the village to capture that knowledge that people have. And I had a look around in my own house, and came up with a whole range of different scrapbooks. And here you see the loft room, which is behind me as I speak, full of the usual clutter, and hidden away in there are various books of various sorts. And you can see there a miscellany of scrapbooks with all sorts of odds and ends in there, photographs and brochures and goodness knows what. Really not of great interest, but buried in the corner of our loft were these two scrapbooks. In fact, I think there's more of them, and these are from my wife's family, and they are absolutely fascinating when you look through them. Here, for example, April 1913. This is Oldbury Hall. And my wife's maiden name is Knowles Jackson. You can see a signature in the bottom right hand corner there of that name. And this was the family home of the KJs, you know, 100+ years ago. So when I married my wife, I thought, this is great. You know, I'm marrying her for money rather than love, until I found out that she didn't have any money. So we 42 years later, we still somehow seem to hang together, and very much a couple, I'm pleased to say. But there's Oldbury Hall, which was actually destroyed in the Second World War in the bombings. And as you delve into this, here you get an insight into the way people live their lives. Winter sports in the winter, theatre trips, hotel stays in the summer. And of course, it tells us something about this particular lifestyle. Not the lifestyle that many of us live these days, of course. And then along comes the First World War. And here you see that sort of great outpouring of patriotism and the great engagement that there was with so many people at that time. And just look at this, all of these people killed in action. And the gentleman there with the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, my late father-in-law's former regiment. And just think of the history that's locked up in here. If we could only uncover it and investigate more of it. And then what did ladies do at that particular time? They engaged in good works of various sorts. And then after the war, life resumed pretty much as it was, but only for a limited period, because of course there were just, traumatic changes in society at around that time. We're all familiar with the traumas in the interwar period, which affected and laid down the grounds for further dramatic change that took place in the late 30s and 40s. So scrapbooks tell us an awful lot. If only we have the key to unlock it. If only we can access that data and that information. So I took the opportunity to speak to the Hampshire Records Office, who were very, very helpful, and said, well, scrapbooks are great records, and the WI scrapbooks of the 1950s and 60s, are a tremendous resource. But the problem with scrapbooks is that even these high quality leather bound ones, after 100 years, start to fall apart and the pages fall out. They're prone to all sorts of decay unless they're stored properly and looked after. And the one thing that was really impressed upon me, that should be very, very careful of, the devil's invention. And the devil's invention is sellotape. Loathed by archivists, I'm told. And the key problem with scrapbooks is indexing and retrieval of information, and how that information is obtained. So, the scrapbook generated an enormous amount of interest, but somehow, it has significant inadequacies. Now, the next element that contributed to this was the idea of the village recorder. Whoops, what's this? Let's get rid of that. And we used to live in Suffolk, and in fact, the head teacher of the school next to the cottage we lived in a very small Suffolk village was a well-known local historian called Peter Northeast, and Heather Needham at the records office actually knew him when she worked in Suffolk. So it was very interesting to have a dialogue with her. But some friends from that village where we all used to live downsized and moved into a village called Badwell Ash. And we were going up to visit them. So I thought I'd just check out on the internet what could be found out about Badwell Ash. And in the Badwell broadsheet, I found this particular article about the village recorder scheme. And look what it says here. A network of volunteers to ensure that the present is adequately recorded at a local level for the future. A recorder will note significant happenings in their parish and collect their local parish magazine, leaflets, election pamphlets, newspaper cuttings, and so on. So I thought, well, this is really interesting, and I wanted to know more about Badwell Ash, and I came across the Badwell Ash Heritage site, and in a way, this is analogous to the Hambledonian. It's the way that the group in Badwell Ash communicate with their audience, and you can see the index down there in the bottom left-hand corner. And it's absolutely fascinating to look at this site. Very, very professional, very, very nicely done. You know, a hugely impressive piece of work, and one can see that the website that they have here is the repository of information. It's the place that you'll go to find out, you know, whatever it was you wanted to know. You know, so a great digital resource. So I thought, well, maybe there's a way that we can put together the idea of the scrapbook with its engaging interest, but also the downsides that go with it, with the idea of the village recorder, with a healthy dose of technology, to come up with the idea of what I call a scrap blog. So borrowing the idea of the blog from the concept of the web blog. And being the type of person I am, I want it to be feasible at the lowest possible cost, because if we can make it easy and cheap to use, then there's a much higher chance of it being utilized. And what I wanted to clarify in my own mind as much as anything is why this was possible. Why should it be done? So I, if you like, wrote a mission statement for it to capture a personal perspective of the ephemera and trivia of village life and to preserve it for posterity. Now let's pick out just a few words there. A personal perspective. So this is the perspective of the person who writes the scrap blog. It's their interpretation of what they're observing. Might not be your interpretation, but it's their interpretation. But we could have several people compiling a scrap blog and get some contrasting views. Nothing wrong with that. The ephemera of village life. So the things that might actually be really interesting now, but end up getting thrown away or just too delicate to survive. So maybe we could preserve them for the future. And trivia, not in the sense of trivial, irrelevant, but trivia in the sense of commonplace, the day-to-day things that we all take for granted, that maybe in a few years' time, you know, would be of great interest. I mean, I have on my desk behind me some petrol coupons from 1975. You know, when there was a rationing of petrol. Well, everybody had petrol coupons then, but how many people have got them now? You know, they've ended up being thrown away or destroyed in some way. And in this, using this principle, then maybe we can capture content that can be digitized using low cost or minimal cost technology that most of us have available. And the type of things we're talking about here in terms of the elements, the input, if you like, to the scrap blog, images, documents, audio files, and the various artifacts associated with that. And then the village recorder, somebody who actually wants to do the job, always helpful, but can capture the things that would otherwise pass us by in our village. I mean, I was delighted one morning when I was looking out of my window in the kitchen, and I saw the bus turning round. Hambledon is the end point for the bus service, so it turns round in Hambledon to make its way back to Denmead. And I saw the bus mount the pavement, and the wing mirror of the bus just caught the bus shelter, which ended up in the middle of the road as matchwood. So I rushed out with my camera to capture it. And you know, how many people can say they've got a photograph of the bus shelter in the middle of West Street in Hambledon? Well, there we are. So an unusual incident, and one which otherwise would go unrecorded. And the technology, well, in line with my philosophy being as cheap as possible, and using things which are commonly available. And the purpose, the process, is to achieve a consistent labeling, indexing and recording of data. And I think a process is important here. And I'll explain why in a moment. So here are the tools that I use. A laptop with office software on it, a mobile phone, and of course a mobile phone is a lot more than a mobile phone these days. It records, it takes photographs, it has storage data on it, it transmits images, does all sorts of things. The printer, which actually its main use, what I use it for, is as a scanner rather than a printer. And you'll see there one of my cameras, you know, as Roger mentioned, I'm a keen photographer. So it's actually, you know, quite an expensive camera. Well, not that expensive. My wife is listening. It was really cheap, actually. And attached to it is a directional microphone. And a directional microphone really improves the quality of recording enormously. And if you look on the internet and you seek to buy one, you could easily pay £100, £150 for a directional microphone. But I got this on eBay for £30. So, you know, really not that expensive. And I can, if by any means, if I did want to sell it, I could sell it on eBay for about the same sort of money. So in my book, not terribly expensive. Now, the role of the process is to join the dots. It's a way in which we coordinate the activities from input to output. It means that we can have a consistent way of recording information. It can make decisions as to how we record that data. And of course, you can always improve a process. And one of the challenges that we have with any sort of digital recording is the file structure and the file nomenclature, so that you can actually record that data and then retrieve it quickly and easily. So here's the type of things that might be entered into that process. There's a picture of Eric with his wife Muriel, and I've got a lovely audio recording of Eric at his 80th birthday talking about when he worked on a local farm. And I did contemplate playing it to you this evening, but I felt that was probably a technological step too far, and it was, you know, doomed for disaster, I suspect. And there's the WI barbecue, to which husbands are invited, largely indulging in their hobby of drinking as much of the wine as possible that's available there. And then the various artifacts, you know, these are the programs. There's a program for the Dick Barton, the Tango of Terror, one of the amateur dramatics productions. And there's the election material, which I suspect in most households transmits straight from the letterbox to the recycling bin, and a really charming order of service for the marriage of Jane and Steve, a lovely couple in the village who got married a couple of years ago, as you can see there. So those are the sorts of things that that we can store. And here's the way that we can name those files. And you'll see here, I've got a naming protocol, as it were. So it starts off with VR for village recorder. And then I've adopted an androgynous title of PS Pat Smith, so that could be anybody. And then a 6-letter date code. And then either the file format for the scrapblog, either Word or PDF, or some form of title, some form of description of what that might be. So this is what my file structure looks like. This is the Scrapblog files in both PDF and Word format. Here are some image files. You can see there a village show image taken on the 24th of August 2019. Here's the play program from November 2019. That's the Tango of Terror. And you can quickly and easily retrieve this information using those criteria in the search box. So date, keywords, and other indexing tools enable you to pull that out quite nicely. Just a point on the use of PDFs. What I've found with relatively large files, such as the Scrapblog files, is that if you transmit them from one machine to another, the formatting and registration tends to change slightly. So what I've found is it's best once you've arrived at the final product to record it as a PDF, which then becomes a permanent record. So the end point of a process is the output. So the output is a Scrapblog file, a physical file. So if our history group was to have another event, I could actually go along with the file to engage the audience. Typically with a word processor. So far, I've used Microsoft Word with the Advantage newsletter template, and you'll see what that looks like in the top right-hand corner there. So that digital file is then outputted as a print version and kept in a ring binder using a simple domestic printer. There is the possibility of a web version, but I haven't quite got that far yet. But you'll see here in the options that you have with the newsletter template, you can actually present it as a web layout. So there is a possibility of presenting this on a website at a later date. And then finally, in terms of storage, I've got a friend who used to work for the BBC, and what she told me was that the BBC now regards storage as essentially free. Storage is so cheap now that it's essentially limitless. The challenge, though, is the format in which it's stored. So if you think back a few years ago, we used to have VHS video recorders, and then we had DVDs. But now I look at my desktop and my laptop. They don't have a CD slot. The CD itself has become antiquated. So if you record all your material in a format that subsequently goes out of production, the question then is, how do you access it? And in particular, one of the major problems is the hardware to play these on, because the hardware tends not to be preserved whilst the storage medium is. So here's some example pages, and I actually started the Scrapblog on the 1st of July 2019, and you'll recognise in that picture the corner of the New Inn that I referred to earlier, the corner of West Street and Vicarage Lane. And there is a police van parked outside the door there, and sadly, very sadly in this house, because it was a real tragedy, a murder took place. The first murder in the village since 1782. So if that wasn't a significant event, I don't know what is. It's perhaps a slightly unfortunate circumstance in which to start the Scrapblog, but there it is. Of course, it can can be changed in the future. But there's an article on that. Then, of course, the installation of our new vicar. Here is a birthday celebration held in the village hall for a lovely lady locally, and lots of villagers pictured there, as you can see. And in due course, everybody will be picking them out, I'm sure. The Hambledon man shed. In its first year of operation, so a small but interesting event, and again, members of the committee pictured in that particular photograph. But then, of course, we had the epidemic, and The problem is that virtually everything in the village shut down. You know, the shows, the activities, the plays, the meetings didn't take place. So I exercised my editorial discretion and reverted to type, and relied a lot more on photographs to populate the blog. And you can see there some of the local chaps larking about, and here is the celebration of VJ Day and the virtual village show that was held as well on that particular day. So there is an example of some pages. And the electricity meter from the village hall. I'm also on the village hall committee, and I'm still in discussion, if I put that in polite inverted commas, with British Gas, arguing about the bill, and that's been going on for 18 months now. But I'm determined to win. I shall wear them down. They shall not defeat me. The final page in Scrapblog was Christmas 2020. So it spanned a period of 18 months or so. And this is what the print version looks like. And of course, this is not the version of record. The digital copy is the version of record. But there it is presented with, in this particular case, some of the artifacts which in reality would be scanned, and copies of the scan would be included there, and the originals would be stored. And there is Stephen Jane's wedding, making the front cover of the Hambledonian. So, you know, a lovely local event. So where have we got to? 18 months or so on. It's been a real learning curve, and coping with the academic was a left of field event that nobody could have anticipated. I have, in the best academic tradition, sought peer review from colleagues in the history group. I have developed some documentation to try and capture the process and the concepts in there, and I've also given some thought to the word processor and the capture program that's used to record the data. Now, in the world I live in, there are no such thing as problems. There are only offers, which are opportunities for improvement. And, you know, taking into account some of the feedback I've had, you know, about the consistency of the format. Should it be chronological? Should it be topical? Should it be thematic? I think really that's a matter of taste and discretion of the village record. But I think it's probably a good idea if it's one or the other, rather than something, the jumble that I've got, where it started off chronological and then switched to thematic and topical, thanks to the epidemic. And the tone that's used, I think it's important that the village recorder puts something of their personality in there, that they have an opinion, that they interpret those facts and they comment upon them. And I commented to one of my colleagues, I hope you don't find it too spiky, where I'm perhaps a little sharp in my comments. And he said, but it's the spikiness that makes it interesting. You know, a little bit of spice in there helps. But of course, we've got to be aware that we're talking about real people, and we mustn't be gratuitously insulting and defame them in any way. But you know, fair comment is, I think, it is permissible. You know, and the pagination, making sure that you get the whole of one topic on the same page, for example. And if there's one thing I've learned from this, for goodness sake, get the names right, and check and double check the names of those involved. The artifacts and exhibits can be stored separately, but can be presented in the blog using photographs or scans. And by keeping it media neutral, you know, so that it could be presented in hard copy, in various formats, including web format, that would improve the opportunities to distribute it. And I think a real problem that I've come across is with regard to the software. I mentioned earlier, I want this to be low cost or minimal cost. Well, unfortunately, Microsoft have now switched to a subscription model as a way of maintaining their income, but that has the contrary effect of decreasing mine. So, are there ways in which we can use free software such as LibreOffice to substitute for it? And at the moment, I think that's very much an open question. I don't have an answer to that one. And then, should it be embargoed in some way? Should this be put away for 5 or 10 years to mature, to give time for events to fade and for people to reflect on what's happening? So those are some of the thoughts that and feedback that I've had so far. Where I'm going in the future is to seek further feedback, and I welcome feedback from anybody who's listening to this, to see if I can find a free and web-friendly word processing program, which unfortunately the subscription model for Microsoft Word is not. And for Apple users out there, Apple have recently updated the operating system to take it to a different format, 64-bit rather than 32-bit. So your legacy software that you may have bought outright will no longer work on it, which is a problem that I'm up against. I think there's great opportunity to capture the narrative account of people through the interviews, and to conduct interviews using the type of equipment that I was demonstrating earlier. And we were talking about this at our history group meeting just last night. We've recently lost a villager whose family go back in the village, several generations, and all of that knowledge and all of that insight has been lost with his passing. So I welcome suggestions as to how to take this further forward, and I welcome any feedback that anybody has. I have available, and this is really very minimal information, but just a couple of pages on what I've done so far, just to sketch in a little bit more detail. If anybody would like copies of that, I'm very, very happy to share them with you, and would welcome any feedback that you have on it. I make no bones that these are very modest pieces of work, but they might just serve as memory joggers for the discussion that we've had so far. So, in the words of John Ebden, if you have been, thank you for listening.
We have a couple of questions that have come in already, so if I can just refer them to you. One question from Barry Sherlock is, how do you compare the Scrapblog with local newspapers? Check that plug too.
I think what local newspapers lack are firstly the minutiae of the detail, and secondly the local interpretation and colour that a village recorder can add. I think also, I think it's fair to say that local newspapers are not quite as local as they used to be. The days when a local cub reporter would spend his day at the magistrate's court, recording that somebody was fined 10 bob for parking their car on Speltham Hill, as I was told a few weeks ago. So it lacks that detail, it lacks that personal connection, it lacks that interpretation, and I think that's also the distinction between local newspapers and something like a diary entry that might be made. In that a diary is a narrative account that is yet to be interpreted, and I think it's that interpretation that adds that flavour, that essence that makes it distinctive and makes it interesting to other people who may be broadly familiar with the people and events involved.
And the other question about the blog, the Scrapblog, is do you see there are any issues of privacy involved in what you record?
Yes, I think one has to exercise a certain amount of discretion here. There are some things that perhaps are inappropriate to record, and maybe an embargo period is a way in which that can be allowed to mature slowly, so that the immediacy of a difficult event is diffused by perhaps people moving away or the event being put into context. But yes, I think that is a very real issue, and something that perhaps the guidelines to village recorders should note.
I've got a tech question from Heather Needham, but before I present that to you, can I just ask you to clarify? You mentioned about storage of the digital files that you create being essentially or viewed by the industry as being free these days. Presumably you're meaning cloud storage. Is that what you're thinking of?
Yes. I mean, you can store. I had a backup on an online cloud storage which cost me about £50 a year.
Yeah.
And that was virtually limitless. But actually, I now have a couple of external hard drives that I use here. But the art and craft of storage is to back up twice and keep them in different locations.
Yes, absolutely. I remember my husband storing lots of his research in the garage on CDs out there in those days, as well as something in the house and something in the archival store where he was working at the time. So yes, you definitely need to do all of those things. You showed us some extracts. So what you were showing us in terms of your kind of like inventory, your finding aid to where the documents were stored that you'd created. That was using straightforward Microsoft software, was it? Because I didn't recognize.
It was, yes. All of what that which you saw was produced with Microsoft Word Advantage template, newsletter template. And if anybody can suggest a substitute for that at lower cost, I'd be thrilled to know.
Right, I've softened you up enough now. I'll give you Heather's question. She said her question may be a bit archivist, anorak, but she'd like to ask you if you would consider uncompressed rather than compressed images and audiovisual formats. That's sort of part one.
Yes.
Yes. Part two is, would you consider deposit with Hampshire Collection of UK Web Archive?
Those are both interesting questions. I mean, the images that are used in this are actually relatively low resolution. They're no more than 1 or 2 megabytes at the most, and the file sizes are pretty compact. So I don't think I don't see the size of the files being a major issue. I mean, a few gigabytes on a hard drive would store quite a lot of information. And one of the things we discussed in our history group was how this should be stored. And I think there is an interesting issue about storing them or passing them to the records office for storage. And I think ultimately that should be the destination of them. Quite when and where that should take place, I think is more of a mute question, because of course there are potentially people's sensitivities around these issues, and once they pass outside the control of the village recorder or the local history group, then they're potentially public access. They must be considered as public access, but I don't see a problem with that, because ultimately a lot of this information becomes open to public access. There are many public archives that one can access in terms of data.
That comes back again to your sensitivity of the information that's effectively published, isn't it? And Heather also then says she thanks you for name checking her and Peter Northeast.
Well, I'd be delighted to have her opinion on the points that she raised.
Heather, do you want to come back?
So could I come in with a question?
Yes, please do, Roger.
Roger, have you carried on recording during 2021?
I haven't done, no. no.
Right.
This was really, I regarded my job as to develop the process and develop the idea and the concept to a workable level, and then, you know, present it to a wider audience, for which you've kindly given me the opportunity.
Have you found anybody else in your village who would like to continue the task of recording?
Not at this stage, but I think that's I think that's something that we're discussing as a history group at the moment.
Right, right. Because having a multiplicity of recorders allows you to have a variety of perspectives, of course, and you build up a richer picture that way, in my mind, rather than just having a single narrative emerging, as it were, of village events.
Absolutely.
But it's easier said than done, I know, trying to get volunteers.
I mean, it would be fascinating to get, you know, the more mature residents who've been in the village a long time, but maybe compare and contrast that with, you know, a teenager or
some of the incomers, yes,
primary school pupil, you know, and to get their different perspectives. Yeah.
Have you thought of involving the school?
We did discuss that at our most recent history group meeting.
Right.
Right. I have an observation really from Andrew Flanagan, who says that he knows of. He says you can. Sorry, it's difficult when you give you a web address, isn't it? The unitysoft.com sell proper MS products with lifetime pricing. So he mentions a couple of things there. So I can the chat things that we're discussing, I'm reading from, will actually become a sort of Word file. So I can ping that on to you, Roger, and
thank you.
For anybody else who would like to follow this up. Lifetime pricing looks like quite high prices to me, but maybe I'm just naive about this. But he says Office 2016 would be £199 as a lifetime version, but yeah. So he says no subscriptions, no monthly fee. I think Andrew must work for this Unitysoft company, you know. That's very attractive. But no, thank you. That's very useful to know, actually. So he gives some other prices and things as well.
Yeah.
Heather comes back and says would recommend deposit with HRO sooner rather than later. They have processes in place to deal with the closure of sensitive material.
Great.
So bear that in mind. And I will send a chat file on to you, as I said, so you've got a record of some of these things. Ray Davis says the scrapblog would be a great idea for villages and perhaps for roads within a town. He wanted to comment that they've recently found to their horror that MP3 is not a suitable vehicle for saving audio files due to degradation. And do you say WAV or WAV? Is
WAV, yeah.
I don't know if any other local historians here could comment with more authority than a non-techie. And Heather agrees with that comment. We've got a whole sort of debate going on without.
Yeah, that's interesting. This is fascinating. Thank you. Yes.
Barry, I'm not quite sure what your comment. You say surely there is public access within the village. You mean to the data that Roger is.
Roger was saying that he was worried that once it went to the HRO, assuming it was an open access, and Heather says it might be embargoed, if it were in the HRO, it would be open to public access. Well, surely in the village it's open to public access. Otherwise, is it not the case?
It's only open to those I care to show it to at the moment, Barry.
Okay.
It's not a public body, is the point, Barry. I think that's where the freedom of information comes into play. I think you have to be a public body or to be. So I think if the town council were keeping it, for instance, it would be a public body. But if it's a local society, I think it would probably be rather different. Let's see what else we've got here. Right, Janet says the National Archives website has advice on the file formats suitable for recording archival material to avoid degradation.
Yeah, thank you, yes.
I think that's all I've got. Oh, Roger, Andrew has come back and said he uses WAV lossless format for oral interviews. And so he's giving a bit more clarification on those prices and products he quoted earlier.
Lovely.
I wanted to I want to come back on something. Oh, you mentioned about doing interviews. I think there are loads of people who can give you advice on oral history interviewing, Roger. There are lots of organisations that have done it. Padmini Broomfield, for instance, is a freelancer who I'm sure may be willing to give you advice. But there have been loads of these oral interview projects. You know, how best to go about it, what questions to ask, and I think Hampshire Record Officer Heather has done something similar, haven't you? Has done something similar up in Hampshire. Is that right, Heather?
Just finding the unmute button. Sorry, Sue.
Yes, so you're speaking here, you know, Heather.
Yes, we run Archive Ambassadors course. So for Archive Ambassadors Read Village Recorders, and we've done them for, I believe, about 10 years on site. And during the recent lockdown, we transferred them online, and they provide advice and guidance on oral history, certainly, digitisation and things digital, and that one goes the way that the group wants it to go. So it might focus on web archiving, or it might focus on, I don't know, database IPR or something. It depends on the interest of the group, whereas the oral history one is much more about what makes a good recording and the software and hardware to use. And then there's a session on cataloguing and a session on preservation. So yes, I believe former Conservator colleagues would say that sellotape is the devil's invention.
Thank you, Sue. I just say thank you very much indeed, Roger, for your fascinating talk. It's plenty of food for thought, I think, for those communities that have never considered making a record of the present for the benefit of our successors in the future. And I hope maybe that may stimulate action in a number of communities, and possibly, who knows, a village recorder network in Hampshire emerging, to model perhaps on the one in Suffolk. But thanks again, Roger, and we wish you well, and we hope that Hambledon thrives, and as soon as things get back to normal, as we've discussed, it would be very good, and maybe some people who are with us this evening might be interested in having actually a visit to Hambledon with some talks about the history of the village, different aspects, and to look round at some of your buildings that have a particular interest. So thanks again, Roger. Okay.
And to taste the wine.
We could even arrange a trip to the vineyard if you wish.
You're on.
On that note, I think we'd better terminate the proceedings.
Thank you very much indeed. Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.